and we've got two panelists who are going to give their insights and draw upon their lifelong expertise in these fields. Maria Demertzis is the Deputy Director of Bruegel and previously worked in the European Commission in their DG for Economics and Finance. She's taught at the Kennedy School at Harvard University and at the University of Strathclyde in Scotland, where she obtained her PhD, and she's a noted commentator here in Brussels from the think tank world, and we'd like to hear your reflections and perspective on these issues. Over to you.
Thank you very much for the introduction and also for the very warm welcome, for inviting me back to the Parliament to discuss something, of course, which we read every time with great interest. We absorb all the messages that you have to say, and we also look very, very closely to the analysis. So thank you very much for inviting me to say a few words on this. I'd like to make one comment on methodologies or numbers, if you like, and then the bulk of my comments will be on the policy recommendations, because often we argue that we know what we need to do, but actually I will show you that we don't all agree on what to do. Here is a graph that I have taken from what my colleague Joel Darvas has just published in a little blog, in which he was trying to make a point that one of the crucial methods that we use in terms of guiding fiscal policy, recommendations for fiscal policy, can lead us in very different directions. So this is the famous discussions on whether we should be using output gaps for fiscal policy or indeed any other policy. This is a graph of the disagreements. And there are disagreements on two countries here. You can take this discussion on other countries. These are two countries in the Eurozone, Germany and Italy. And I have here three forecasters, three institutional forecasters, the IMF being one of them. These are the numbers for the previous forecast, not the current ones. The European Commission and the OECD. So the very thick lines, which are typically on the top, are done for Germany, and the lighter lines are for Italy. And the different colors just represent the institutions and how they disagree. And I think there's a couple of interesting points here. The most important, I think, disagreement here is that if you take the European Commission numbers, forecasting, and the latest forecast, for the latest year, as it were, Italy and Germany look very similar. Right, this is what the European Commission is telling us in terms of the output gap messages. The IMF and the OECD is telling a very different story for Italy than for Germany. And that's a very, very important messages, because you will be recommending to Germany and Italy to do different things. So there are important messages here, and I think what the message of my colleague was in contributing to this discussion is that this isn't a very reliable measure in terms of telling you what to do, and therefore you should perhaps look for other things. But I think for the moment, all the policy recommendations that are coming are based on this number, and I'd like to drive the message here that there are very different views as to what countries should be doing when it comes to the measure of the output gap. That of course, is not, this is a very big discussion, I don't want to dwell on it, but I think I need to draw some caution in that, what we need to do is not necessarily the same depending on where the message is coming from. Now, my next graph is the graph that the IMF has produced, and I think this is really a wonderful graph because it's very telling and immediately. Basically, as Paul said in his presentation, you need it to be as green as possible. And you also see the difference between the 2018, how the picture is changing from 2018 to 2019 and is getting less green. So if for a moment we can assume that the numbers that we used here are indeed indicative, and again, as I raised in my first graph, there could be disagreements on this, then the message is that we are not doing as good as we would like to do. And therefore, the recommendation here is that those countries that can, they should do more on the fiscal side. Those countries that cannot, they simply should be driven by sort of stabilization issues, stabilization concerns about the medium term. And here, if you allow me, Paul, I'd like to make one clarification, because I think this certainly in the Brussels context, I think this is not necessarily understood by everybody the same way. We are asking countries like Germany and Italy to do more on the fiscal side, and we are asking other countries that don't have the space to simply just deal with legacy issues before they can use the fiscal instrument. But when we ask Germany and Germany and the Netherlands to do more, we have to remember what it is that we're asking them to do. We are not asking them to do more on the fiscal side, on the stabilization side, because that would be an advice of doing pro-cyclical fiscal policy. And that is not what we want. We don't want pro-cyclical fiscal policy. We want to save in good times and spend in bad times on the cyclical side. What the message here is, when we're asking Germany and the Netherlands to do more on the fiscal side, is on the medium term and is on the natural rate of output, namely on the capacity. So we are asking these countries to invest, not on the business cycle, but we're asking them to simply bring potential output up. And this is guided by medium and long-term concerns, not from business cycle concerns. This is an obvious point I'm making, but I think it's an important point, because when we talk about fiscal policy, we're not advising pro-cyclical fiscal policy. We are advising investing in the future, so therefore the output gap closes, but it closes from the denominator, not from the numerator. I think this is a very important point, and this is the next slide is the one that I really like that slide, because it drives that message very clearly. It makes this point very clearly. It is the title of the slide is indeed medium-term concerns for both those who can and those who cannot. Those who can invest in the future, those who cannot resolve the legacy issues. This is, I think, very sound fiscal advice, but it's important that we clarify that. But the message here, unfortunately, when it comes to the fiscal policy, and now I'm talking about the business cycle fiscal policy, the stabilization side of fiscal policy, is that there is basically little to do, because those who can don't need it, and those who cannot, well, they can't. So they can't do anything on the fiscal stabilization side. So, on the fiscal side, the news are not very good. Not the investment side, the fiscal side and the stabilization side. So if we are faced with a cyclical downturn, it says here, in case of a severe downturn, be ready to do more. There's very few of the European countries that actually can do something. So on the fiscal side, in my view, there's not going to be much ammunition, I think, to deal with a fiscal downturn. And that, of course, brings me to the other tool, and I'm delighted that Governor Holzmann is here, because I think that's also the other side of the argument on macroeconomic policy mix, is the monetary policy side. Now, these are two graphs. The left-hand side graph is inflation and the core inflation. This is the gray and the blue area. The colorful lines are projections for till 2050, which are derived from inflation-based swaps. On the right-hand side is the interest rate. And the two colorful lines are, again, projections for 2050. And you have two different color lines here. The forecast was done, the upper lines were done in April, and the lower lines were done in August. So you see revisions in this inflation step forecast that are remarkable in my view. But the messages that they're giving us is that the markets, which is basically who is talking here in the forecast, the markets are not expecting inflation to go to 2% for another 10 years. And only in 30 years from now, they're expecting it to go to the target. And when it comes to the interest rates are sort of in the long term are going to be pretty much at zero. They're going to be negative for 10 years, and then they're going to be zero after that. Okay. Now, take the two graphs together, and the forecast for the real interest rate. In the long term, if I may call this the equilibrium real interest rate, is negative. Now, why am I saying this? This is what this picture is telling us. I don't know that this is true, and one has to understand that it's not so easy to forecast numbers for 2050, nor am I trying to do that. But the markets believe that this is the picture, the way they understand it today. Why am I saying all this? I'm saying all this because, to the extent that you want to advise that monetary policy needs to sort of continue to be accommodative, and we can agree or disagree on the space that there is, but irrespective of the space there is for monetary policy will have to operate in the dark. Because the things that what this picture is telling us is things that we don't understand. Negative interest rates in equilibriums, or Phillips curves that are totally flat, or the transmission mechanism of QE, which is basically unknown. I mean, we have not studied that. We don't really know the risks associated with all these unconventional tools, implies that we need to do things, and I personally think we need to do things on the monetary policy, but we will do it in the dark. Namely, that our knowledge and our understanding of the operations of monetary policy are not what they used to be. It's very, very incomplete. So, one has to ask, fiscal policy, we don't have much space, and on monetary policy, if you decide to do more, you will have to do it basically with your eyes closed. I'm exaggerating for effect, you appreciate. But I think there is an element here of uncertainty which requires that caution is important, and the other thing which is important is buffers. Buffers and understanding that we cannot be operating on the baseline scenario, because the baseline scenario is very, very uncertain. We need to understand that, I think in my view, policy needs to be done for a variety of circumstances, the probability assigned to which will be unknown. So the baseline, I mean, policy based on baseline, I think, is something of the past. In the future, we cannot rely on policy based on baseline scenario. So where does that leave us? What do we do next? I mean, the fiscal policy on the country level is very little. Monetary policy is what it is. And that brings me, I think, to the need of something that is not new, and I would agree is politically infeasible, but I will say nevertheless, I think we need to go in the direction of building up fiscal capacity certainly at the euro area level. And I mean meaningful fiscal capacity that is there to help the stabilization of the cycle, because that is you know, the arguments for that had always been there, but I think they're becoming more prominent simply because the instruments that we have in our hands are very incomplete, but also because, if I may reflect on what Vice President Karas has said in his introductory remarks, the challenges that are coming from outside will require one voice. And they will require one voice not just on fiscal policy, they will require one voice on trade. Whatever we believe we should do vis-a-vis a very aggressive US position on trade will require a common position and understanding on China, which has to be a European position on China. It cannot be a country position on China. It would require consensual competition view. So all of these things require one voice. And if we are capable of achieving, or not capable as the case may be, of achieving one voice on issues of competition, trade, and effectively industrial policy, which is going to be the next thing to discuss, I simply cannot see why we cannot have one voice when it comes to stabilization, and stabilization implies a fiscal and monetary policy mix. So fiscal will be a component of this, which needs to be done better than it is today, given what little space there is. Structural reforms, which is, of course, the mantra both for the IMF and for the European Commission, is correct, and we need to continue with that, but it doesn't really add much to meeting the challenges of the future in terms of new things. We need to do new things, in my view, and I think the one-voice argument is crucial. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Those were terrific remarks.